Today we're looking at energy, both how it's made and then how it is used by the cells. So beginning with autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means how something is nourished. So an autotroph is a self-nourishing organism. You would most commonly know this as plants. So organisms that convert inorganic matter, so if something is inorganic, there is no carbon bonded to hydrogen, matter into organic compounds. The most commonly known organic compound for you at this point would be glucose. So a photosynthetic autotroph. So photo is light, synthetic or synthesis is to make. So it's provided with the energy from the sun that's required for carbon fixation. Carbon fixation is where we change one form of carbon into another. So in photosynthesis, it's changing carbon dioxide, with the help of a few other things obviously, into glucose that cells can then utilise. So a chemosynthetic organism, exactly the same logic as photosynthetic. Instead, this time, it uses chemicals, not light, to synthesise energy. So it's provided with the energy required for carbon fixation from chemical reactions. One of the most commonly known types of this is thermal vents. In the actual leaf of a cell, it's the chloroplasts that make them green. If we actually look at the structure of a chloroplast, it's really interesting, and this is something that you'll need to know in a lot more detail next year. It's got two membranes, so it's got an outer membrane and an inner membrane. It's got stroma, which is like the chloroplast version of cytoplasm. It's got these little stacks of discs that look like Oreo biscuits or casino chips, and they are called granum. The thylakoid is actually the membranes between those. And the chloroplast is the location where plants transform light energy into sugars, so the chemical energy that we can then use for the cell. So the equation for photosynthesis, you know this from primary school. You know that plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they need water to grow. If you don't water a plant, it dies. In the presence of light and chlorophyll, it makes glucose and it breathes out oxygen. So there's only really one thing in that equation that you should not be familiar with. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide, they breathe out oxygen. If you don't water a plant, it dies. So the only new thing is glucose. So chlorophyll is the main light-trapping pigment in plants, and that's what gives it the colour green. In autumn, when plants lose their chlorophyll, they leave behind carotenoids. So that's red, orange and yellow pigments that can also trap light. So if we're looking at the chemical equation for photosynthesis, and I strongly urge you to learn this year, it will make your life a lot easier. So it's all sixes, so it's actually quite easy to remember. So 6 water molecules plus 6 carbon dioxide molecules in the presence of light and chlorophyll goes to glucose and 6 oxygen. If we're looking at the chemical formula, 6H2O, you already know that. 6 CO2, again, you know the formula for carbon dioxide, plus 6 O2, you know oxygen's O2. So again, you have one formula to know, which is C6H12O6, which is glucose. You'll notice that all carbohydrates have the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every 1 carbon, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So in a cell, the light energy is transformed into chemical energy. So that occurs in the chloroplast. There's also these things called enzymes. So enzymes are what we call biological catalysts, and they speed up chemical reactions without actually taking part in the chemical reaction, and they reduce the energy required for this to happen. So the chemical enzyme that transforms light energy into chemical energy is called chlorophyll. So the chloroplast is the structure, the chlorophyll is the actual enzyme. So during daylight, a plant can make glucose and also oxygen, of course. So it takes in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water. In the presence of sunlight energy, when the sun is out, carbohydrates are formed, which is glucose, and oxygen is released that we can then breathe in. So we can actually measure the rate of photosynthesis. So the rate is how fast it is occurring by measuring how much oxygen is produced. Plants in strong sunlight are able to produce a lot of glucose because it can catalyse a lot more reactions. Some desert plants do not photosynthesize during the hottest part of the day. They'll lose too much water, so they keep their stomata closed. If my stomata are closed, I can't actually have gas exchange happening. Without gas exchange, I don't have the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis to actually occur. So instead, the stomata open every morning and night, allowing carbon dioxide to move in and for photosynthesis to occur. And this is one of the adaptations that desert plants have that enable them to obtain the glucose that they need to function and to grow without losing too much water. So plants store the glucose, which is a chemical energy, as starch. They use this energy for cellular processes that occur overnight, such as respiration. So in this graph, it actually looks at the carbon dioxide exchange over time. So if we follow the green line, so when carbon dioxide exchange is low, starch is being used up. So that suggests that that will be during the night because there's not much carbon dioxide going in because the stomata are closed and photosynthesis isn't occurring. When I've got maximum carbon dioxide exchange, that would suggest that photosynthesis is at its greatest. So during this time, I've got loads of photosynthesis happening, so I'm making lots of glucose. I store that excess as starch so that I can use it later on. As the graph goes down, the sun's also going down, and then sun's gone down, photosynthesis stops. So during this time when plants still have to undertake cellular respiration, growth, repair, they use starch as their energy source. So in summary, plants use sunlight to make glucose. The equation for photosynthesis is 6H2O plus 6CO2 in the presence of light and chlorophyll goes to C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Any excess glucose that is produced is stored as starch. So it's great that we've made all this energy. We have to eat to obtain our energy. Then how do we use it? So ATP is the main energy source for every cell. So it's our cell's version of currency. So if I'm in Australia, I spend Australian dollars because that is what the shops will actually accept. If I'm in America, I spend American dollars. If I'm in the cell, I spend ATP. Shortened version of adenosine triphosphate. Once my ATP has been used, it converts to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. And what you'll notice is that I've got these 3 phosphates attached to my sugar, and when one of those breaks off, I go from the triphosphate to the diphosphate. Tri is 3, di is 2. So ATP molecules transfer the energy around the cell. Whenever you see a picture of a cell, always try and identify any of the organelles that you can, because it's good practice to see what you are actually retaining. So what you can see here is that my ATP is hanging around my mitochondria. And then it goes to where it's needed, in this instance, around the nucleus. So I've used my energy, so it goes from ATP to ADP. When it breaks off that last phosphate group, it gives the cell a burst of energy. So what we have here is a diagram that actually shows the relationship between ATP and ADP. So it's a cyclic relationship. So I'm starting at the ATP. So when I break off one of these phosphate groups, I get a burst of energy that gets used by the cell. So things like my muscle cells will have a lot more ATP than something like my fingernails, which don't need as much energy. When I've got my ADP, it takes the cell less energy to reattach this phosphate than to construct a whole new molecule. So you've probably heard of the saying, you've got to spend money to make money. So the cell spends a little bit of money, reattaches that phosphate, and then it goes back to ATP. The burst of energy that I receive is a lot less than the energy that I need to input. So when I've got my three phosphates joined, I've got ATP, battery's fully charged, wallet is full of cash. I spend my money, so I go on a shopping trip to Chatty or Southland, and then I need to, replenish my stocks, so I wait to get paid. I invest a little bit of money, which in this instance is my work, and then I get that phosphate reattached. So my wallet, chock full of cash again. So how do we actually charge the ATP? So as I was just saying, it takes a lot of energy to break off that last bond, which I get that burst of energy for the cell, and it takes a little bit of energy to join it. So it's an investment. One thing that you might notice, this ribose sugar. So think of where else do I find a ribose sugar? And it's got the 5 corners. So I've broken one off, a little bit of energy, brings that back on. So I've got this energy. How do I actually make it? So it's done through cellular respiration. So cellular respiration describes how our bodies convert energy into a usable form. So if you obtain energy in this way, you are classed as a chemoheterotroph. Chemical, hetero, you obtain your nutrients from an outside source, and troph is how you actually get your your energy. So we are heterotrophs, we can't make our own food, and we synthesize our energy through chemicals. So it can occur with oxygen, which is aerobic cellular respiration, or without oxygen, which is anaerobic respiration. On exam questions, you have to be really particular about this. If it is in the presence of oxygen, you have to state aerobic, otherwise you do not get the mark. So if I have aerobic respiration, and this is where I get more bang for my buck, I get a lot more energy. So my inputs, oxygen and glucose. Think back to the photosynthesis equation. It is literally the products from photosynthesis are the inputs for aerobic respiration. My output, carbon dioxide and water vapor. So this is photosynthesis flipped. And then I get 36 ATP. So I get 36 adenosine triphosphate molecules that I can then spend in the cell. So the word equation, so glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide plus water plus 36 ATP. So we get our glucose from the digestive system. When you eat lunch or dinner, that's where you get your energy from. Oxygen from the respiratory system, you breathe in oxygen and then it diffuses across the lungs into your body. Carbon dioxide is a waste product. We exhale our waste product, and water is also exhaled. So if you actually breathe into your hand, you'll notice it actually is a tiny bit wet. So the chemical equation, again, if you know your photosynthesis equation, you then know your respiration equation. So for aerobic cellular respiration, glucose plus oxygen, so C6H12O6, glucose is a carbohydrate, so it has that 1:2:1 ratio. Plus 6 oxygen goes to 6 H2O plus 6 CO2 plus 36 ATP. It happens in 3 stages. At year 11, you need to know the 3 stages, and that's it. Next year, you'll learn what happens in each of the stages. So glycolysis, glucose is split in half in the cytoplasm, and 2 ATP are produced. No oxygen is required for glycolysis. Then we go into the mitochondria, where we have the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. That occurs within the mitochondria, and where 34 ATP are produced. So our net ATP is 36. So cells that need a lot of energy have a lot of mitochondria. That makes sense. So if you've got lots of muscles, you have muscle cells that use lots of ATP. Kidney cells need extra ATP to filter the blood. If your blood's not cleaned, it can actually be quite toxic. More mitochondria, more ATP produced. So how can we actually measure the rate of respiration? If we're measuring respiration, we're measuring ATP production. So the amount of carbon dioxide produced is an indication of respiration. So when we are breathing out the carbon dioxide as a byproduct, we can actually measure that and work out how much we are respiring. So which part of the graph would represent the daylight hours? So the energy needs of the plant do not change during the day. So not all respiration uses oxygen, and this is where we go into anaerobic respiration. So it's producing ATP without oxygen. So if you do heavy exercise, your body can't actually keep up with the oxygen demands. You still make 2 ATP because you still want your muscles to be able to move, but you make lactic acid. So that's that burn in your muscles when you've done exercise that you're probably not used to. So if I went and run a marathon tomorrow, I would have lots of lactic acid built up in my thighs because I don't usually enjoy running. So you make lactic acid instead of carbon dioxide and water. So the equation, this one's great. You don't need to know the chemical formula. If you do chemistry, you will, but for us biologists, we're happy with the word equation. So glucose goes to lactic acid plus 2 ATP. Plant and yeast cells, they're slightly different. They ferment. So fruit continues respiration without oxygen. That's how fruit can still continue to ripen even once you bring it home from the supermarket. So glucose goes to ethanol plus CO2 plus 2 ATP. So it's fermentation, and that occurs in plants. So wine is an excellent example of fermentation. And the carbon dioxide that's produced as a byproduct is what makes the bubbles in champagne. So in summary, So aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen, anaerobic respiration. In plants and yeast you produce ethanol, in animals you produce lactic acid, and you make 2 ATP from anaerobic respiration.